Hi, I'm Danny Duchamp, and I live in Ancapistan in my head. Or so I am told. If you've heard that phrase before, living in Ancapistan in one's head, you probably heard it used derisively. It was probably used by some libertarian who is a little bit tepid on principles, or perhaps just some libertarian adjacent person, criticizing libertarians who are too principled in their view. It'll often be criticizing either their references to anarchocapitalism, saying that that's some utopian future that sounds nice but will never happen, and it's also used against people who are talking about principles when the critic, is talking about political reality, the practical political means that are available to us. I'm going to leave it as abstract as that, except to mention a few of the topics that this is currently brought up in. So some examples might be people talking about vaccine mandates and vaccine mandate bans, people talking about political censorship on social media by social media companies, people talking about borders, and people talking about, well, I think I've given enough examples. When people use that criticism, I think it has two fundamental problems. There are two things about it that I want to question. One is whether it really does make sense to refer to Ancapistan, right? If Ancapistan is not something that we're going to be able to achieve within our lifetimes, isn't it kind of pointless to talk about it? Anarchocapitalism in this view would be some hypothetical toy that you can play with intellectually, but wouldn't actually be something that is actually useful as a concept. Also, I want to question the implied definition of principles that this seems to come with, that a principle is some impossible to pin down abstraction such that it's not something that we need to apply in real life. I disagree with both of these. And I want to start with what principles are, at least in my view. This is what my concept of principles are and why I keep to my principles. So to me, a principle is a general thing. It is something that I use. It's a tool, a thinking tool that I use to try to behave in a way that I think will have good results. The reason I use principles as opposed to just analyzing every situation case by case is because the world is pretty complicated. I don't always know the best thing to do. I don't know of the actions I could possibly take which will have the best net benefit on other people, because I do care to some degree about benefiting other people. I also don't know which one is going to have the lowest chance of pissing them off, so in a way that could affect me. So the principle that I tend to keep to is voluntarism or libertarianism or proprietarianism, which are all actually the same thing. Basically that you should get someone's consent before acting upon them. That is what I mean by a principle. It's I don't know how to act in the world all the time, but I can say this will generally have good results. And the reason, of course, is because of that old thing that I always mention: if two people both consent to something, then we have reason to expect that they both benefit. It's true, it's not 100% effective, but it's the most effective method that we have. So that's why I think that voluntarism and respecting private property rights is a good way to go. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the alternative to just acting on principles. This idea that there's some political reality with which we must deal. The policies usually espoused by these people who will criticize you for living in Ancapistan in your head by being too focused on principles, the policies they will usually espouse will be something along the lines of, well, in this situation, the government's going to enforce its will one way or the other. We should get it to at least enforce the less restrictive will that it can enforce. So the one that damages us the least, right? And if that means that it's going to damage other people more who would like a different kind of rule, well, I mean, that's the political nature that we're faced with. The reason that I don't think that this works is that it implies that politics is pragmatic in the first place. What about politics gave you the impression that it was pragmatic? Right? They're painting a picture, these critics. They're painting a picture where you either stick to your principles, and if you do that, then you'll be just run over by those who don't. Or you deal with political reality, and then what? You won't be run over? It sort of implies that you actually have control over the political system, which you don't. When you engage in politics, your impact, whether it's through your vote or through your advocacy or whatever, is very, 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 very small. The chances that your action is actually going to be the difference between some political reality being enforced upon you or not is essentially zero. Right? So whenever you're acting politically, you must have some other reason for taking that action than a strict, if I do this, I will get this result kind of mentality, at least this political result. Right? So one of the reasons you might take political action is because you want to be moral, right? You think that there's right and wrong ways to behave, and you want to make sure that you're taking good actions, and you think that whilst your effect may be small, once totaled with everyone else, then you can feel good about yourself for being a moral person by taking the action that's going to have a positive result when everyone is summed together. This is not pragmatic. This is not I want this result, therefore I will take this action. It's, I think this result would be good, and I want to be moral and be part of the team supporting that good thing. So in either case, your only justification is some kind of a moral reason. You don't actually, in politics, have the pragmatic action, with a few exceptions, and maybe I'll go into the primary one now, which is concentration, right? If you move somewhere that's a lot freer, you will actually get those results right away, something that I might be taking up as an option fairly soon. But yeah, you do get those results right away if you move somewhere freer, and you have the positive impact of putting pressure on the non-free places to shape up or lose people. So if you're talking about moving from place to place, there's some argument that you actually do have a pragmatic, in fact, forget some argument, it's pretty clear that you do have a pragmatic reason to engage in that. But political advocacy, like the government should take this policy, you don't have any pragmatic reason to do that. Right? Anyone who's saying that by focusing on principles, you're just going to get run over by the people who deal with political reality, you're going to get run over either way. Your actions have effectively no impact on the polity. Right? So principles and morality and that stuff, that's what we're dealing with. Sorry if you do not like that. If you do not, just ignore politics. That's the rational thing to do. Okay, the other thing is Ancapistan. Is Ancapistan even worthwhile to think about? Right? What if we're never going to see it in our lifetimes? What's the point of thinking about it? And to answer that, I want to talk about thermodynamics. So in physics, I believe it's the second law of thermodynamics states that entropy will increase in a closed system, right? So basically, to sum it all up in kind of a simplification, but I think it actually does describe the point, things will run down and sort of reach a place of rest unless there's some energy coming into the system from outside, right? So if you've got a machine, it's going to go through its processes until it ends at some final resting state, right? Some examples would be the rolling a dice. It's eventually going to just stop. It's not just going to roll forever, right? So everything eventually comes to some final resting place if it's a closed system. The problem with this is that there is no such thing as a closed system. That dice is actually affected by lots of other things coming at it from different directions. Right? There's no such thing as a closed system. Entropy tends to increase in a closed system, but there's no such thing as a closed system. Aren't physicists stupid? They are living in entropy in closed systems in their heads. No, that's ridiculous. Even though a closed system is not something that you're actually going to encounter, every system is going to have energy coming into it from somewhere. Maybe the entire universe is a closed system, but even that, And nonetheless, like, if that's the only example of a closed system, then it still makes it a pretty useless concept by the logic of the people who say you shouldn't live in Ancapistan in your head. But of course, the reason that you have the idea of a closed system is that for various intents and purposes, some systems can be treated as closed. When you take a principle all the way to the extreme, you can see how it fundamentally behaves, right? Well, is the principle really correct? Does the principle really pan pan out, what are the real implications of this principle, right? So you take it all the way to the extreme to sort of see what fundamentally the principles are, and then you can pull back and say, well, in this more complicated reality, how does that apply now? I think that Ancapistan is kind of like that, right? Ancapistan, anarchocapitalism, I'm going to stop saying Ancapistan because it makes it cringier than it needs to be, which it's already pretty cringy. Anarchocapitalism is like the closed system, right? It is, well, we think that we've got these good principles, which are like voluntarism, private property, markets, and that kind of thing. What if we take them to the extreme? Is there some reason that they break down? Right? Like if you have an entire society organized on nothing but these principles, will it break down? And if the answer is no, well, that's some good evidence that there are positive things about your principles. They can be taken all the way to the extreme. Well, they seem to be pretty solid. If, on the other hand, it turns out that there is something wrong, like, oh, actually, no, because this market for security in Ancapistan is going to... I said Ancapistan again. In an anarcho-capitalist society is going to cartelize, right? The security companies are going to just reinvent government by cartelizing. If you think that's the case, then you think that in some given market, specifically security, there is a free market tendency towards monopoly or cartelization at least. That is now a critique of your general principles and your general reasoning about free markets and private property that will apply throughout societies that you actually observe, right? So by thinking it through to the extreme, if you think it through to the extreme of Ancapistan, if you find a problem, well, then you should look for that problem in societies and your analyses of them now. If, on the other hand, like me, you think, well, no, I mean, there's security seems to have really low costs of entry. Like technically you need a guy with a gun or even just a big strong guy, and you can provide some security and now there's some competition going. It seems really unlikely that the just myriad of sources of security are going to manage to cartelize if there is actually a robust free market in place. So I think that that's a reason that it won't happen. However, if you did think it would happen, that would be a decent criticism of your principles. I don't think it'll happen, and so that's an affirmation of these principles. So Ancapistan, even just as some mental model, is really quite useful, right? Thinking about anarcho-capitalism and considering yourself an anarchist are useful. That last bit, actually, I should just double down on. Considering yourself an anarchist is really useful, right? And the reason is kind of for a filtration process. If you notice that there's someone who says, oh yeah, totally libertarian, free markets and private property, no coercion, just, voluntary exchange, all that kind of stuff, all for that, hate the state and hate coercion and etc. And then you ask him about anarcho-capitalism and he says, oh, well, no, not that, or it would be bad for this reason, or, the state has some needs or legitimacy. And it's like, well, okay, you're now undermining these principles. So it's evidence that you do not believe in these principles to begin with. And so knowing that people are anarcho-capitalists, they are anarchists, they do support a stateless society run by private property, that is a good way of determining if those people really are in favor of these principles of private property, etc. So yeah, to sum up, like, principles are useful. Politics is not pragmatic in a direct sense in any case, so we really are just focusing on morals and principles and things like that, and you just have to deal with it. Anarcho-capitalism is like a closed system. It's a useful theoretical concept, even if, and that's if, you think that we're not going to be able to reach it in our lifetime. And finally, belief in anarcho-capitalism is a good litmus test for the quality and the strength of a libertarian. Okay. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about today. Here are people. Look how cool these cool people are. And I'm going to be putting onto this list anyone who donates any amount on Odyssey because, alt tech and all that. And yeah, there's a limit. There's a minimum for Patreon, but not for Odyssey. So get on the next one. Be one of the cool people after my cool thoughts. All right, get out of here.